Huh. If I went back in time and did something really, really weird, do you think all this stuff would still be here? Do you think it would still even exist? Do you think there would even be such a thing as a museum? A lot of sci-fi writers have tinkered with the idea of time travel. We're all pretty familiar with grandfather paradoxes and butterfly effects by now. Hell, if you look at basic game design, time travel is all over the place. How many recent games have you played with multiple endings? How many games encourage you to start the whole thing over again and try something new? Or how about this? Have you ever quick-saved or used save states right before a huge challenge? Save scumming is a form of time travel after all. While a lot of these tropes are as old as gaming itself, there's one game in particular that sparked at least a few of them. It was a freak, lightning-in-a-bottle project made by the best and brightest Japanese designers in the RPG industry. It was timeless, it was brilliant, and really defining. So it only makes sense that, for a game like that, Chrono Trigger should be all about time travel. I feel like the best way to start this off is with a little anecdote. I didn't play this game until about 2011 when it came out on the Wii Virtual Console. I picked it up along with the Virtual Console release of Final Fantasy VI, and that summer, I plowed through them both. Before I had played them, I was fully expecting Final Fantasy VI to win me over with its epic, operatic story and friggin' huge cast. I played through and was thoroughly satisfied, but when I picked up Chrono Trigger, I was blown away. I bring this up because there's a lot about Chrono Trigger that separates it from other JRPGs. Up until I had played Chrono Trigger, I felt that the genre had a lot of pretty good things, but also had many things holding it back. For one, grinding. Especially in a lot of the Super Nintendo and PlayStation era RPGs, there's a lot of grinding. Now, this is understandable. These games were $70 to $80 at the time, and developers wanted to make sure those games lasted a while. By pacing level ups and experience very slowly, they could create the illusion that these games lasted 60 to 80, up to 100 hours, which sure looks good on the box. But when you remove all of that padding, you end up with a game that isn't that long or sometimes even strategic. This is something that's still going on today. You look at games like Xenoblade Chronicles X and even Western RPGs like Fallout 4. They all contain a lot of filler quests where you don't really do much of anything related to the story. But this is something that Chrono Trigger wisely averts. While your average Final Fantasy or Persona might take 40 to 90 hours to complete, it only took me about 20 hours to finish Chrono Trigger when I recorded the footage for this video. And that's a completionist run. I did everything. All the items, all the best weapons, all the side quests, everything. Now, that may not look good on the box, but the fact that Chrono Trigger is relatively short is a very good thing. A short length means that an RPG like this needs to focus. There's no side quest where you go collect 20 imp horns for a villager. It's straight story event to story event. The levels and experience are paced so that you're always just the right level for the task at hand, unless you've run away from every single fight or something. This means that the story moves right along at a perfect, enjoyable pace, and every single thread serves the purpose of defeating the bad guy and saving the world. No grinding, no meaningless side quests, all killer, no filler. And on that note, let's talk about something else that Chrono Trigger does very differently from other RPGs. Everything happens on a smaller scale. Now that may sound a little silly considering that this is a game with 5 world maps and a story that spans several million years, but how many playable characters does this game have again? Oh right, only 7. One of them is optional, and another one leaves late in the game for spoilerish reasons that we'll get to. This gives the characters a lot more room to play off of each other and entertain the audience, and the audience can relate to them a lot easier too. I mean, look at the average cast for something like, say, Fire Emblem Awakening. An amazing game, to be sure, but that game has 44 playable characters, and there's no way you can keep track of all of them at a time. The aforementioned Final Fantasy VI has something in the realm of 18 playable characters, and even though they're all well-developed characters, it's hard for them to interact and relate to one another if there's so damn many. But Chrono Trigger only has 7. It feels less like a list of characters and more like a tight-knit family. You know how Robo feels about Luca, and how Luca feels about Ayla, and how Ayla feels about Chrono, and so on and so forth. And none of these characters feels worthless. Like, you know how in every RPG there's that one character that just feels like the load? Or the one that starts out super weak and you have to grind him or her for hours before they end up really good? None of that in Chrono Trigger. Every character brings something valuable to the game. Chrono is the versatile everyman, Marle and Luca are fantastic magicians alone or as a pair, Robo is a fantastic healer as well as a strong attacker, Frog can be deceptively powerful, Magus is good at hitting multiple enemies at once, and Ayla is just such an animal. And they can all work together. There are double techs that you can perform that are more powerful than normal attacks, and every character permutation has a double tech or even triple tech they can use. That brings me to the combat in this game. I love the combat in this game, because it carries that same sense of focus and tightness. In a lot of other JRPGs, when you think of strategy, you think of things like elemental rock, paper, scissors. Like some enemies are weak to fire, some are weak to thunder, you might have a character that's weak to water, etc, etc. And that's present in Chrono Trigger, but it's not the main focus of the game's strategy like it is in a lot of other games. Here, you need to pay attention to where the enemy is and who can attack at the moment. Many of the techs in this game are capable of hitting multiple enemies in a radius, or in a straight line, or so on and so forth. The key to winning the big battles is knowing when the enemies are in a certain formation, and striking when the time is right. And again, you never really lose because you're at a low level. It's because you didn't think your strategy through enough. When you die, you never think to yourself, man, that's a load of bull, or man, do I really have to grind more? You think to yourself, what do I have to do differently to make sure I win? Even the biggest, grandest fights apply here. The final boss adheres to this. In fact, let's use the final boss as an example. I loved this fight because while there was a definite dominant strategy, using Ayla and Chrono to attack all bits at once while Robo was on healing duty, the boss would often throw curveballs and force me to think of new things on the fly. Even though I had god-tier endgame items, Lavos would throw spells at me that rendered them useless. Occasionally, it would cast some down to 1 HP attack that would force me to stop and think about how I was going to get my party back on its feet. When you think you've settled into a comfortable strategy, it often throws a wrench into the plan. And this is the kind of thing that makes boss fights memorable and awesome. Just about every boss in Chrono Trigger does this. Each boss fight has a deliberate pacing curve to always keep you on your toes and thinking of new ideas. You may think you've picked the perfect party for an upcoming fight, but the boss might prove you wrong. It's phenomenal design. And when you have the skills to wipe a regular group of enemies with a couple button presses, it feels fantastic. This is par for the course in RPG design, but because battles are designed around strategy rather than sheer numbers, it feels even better than usual. The audio and visual design of each attack really sells the power and awesomeness behind it. You listen to some of Ayla's kicks and holy crap, they sound really painful. And of course, it's really cool seeing your team cooperate and take down huge threats with one huge attack. But thankfully, those huge attacks are often brief, so that it looks epic without looking tedious. See, every part of this game shares that awesome pacing curve, and I know I bring that a lot in this Favorite Games project, but it's a valuable design philosophy. No part of Chrono Trigger is boring. It applies to the story and the art direction too. It may not be as epic and huge as some of the Final Fantasies out there, but when I played this in 2011, I was surprisingly swept up. This is a game that pays attention to what you do. The game doesn't begin with a battle or assault or anything like that. It begins with a carnival, and the game knows what you're doing at this carnival. If you steal the old man's food so you can have another go at the RoboCat, the game will remember. If you rescue the little girl's kitty, the game will remember. If you don't wait for Marle to choose her candy, the game will remember. After the carnival and a brief tutorial mission, Chrono is accused of a crime, and he goes to trial. And everything you did at that carnival, good or bad, is brought up here. When I first played the game, I had no idea the stuff I did at the carnival was going to matter so much. So when it was brought up and used against me, I was genuinely shocked. Nowadays, a lot of games are expected to pull off this kind of trick, but Chrono Trigger was really the first. It was a deceptive trick that made you think more about the game's world. The game doesn't really pull that trick again, but the carnival does get a callback later in the game, which I'll get to later. I should also talk about the worlds and the artistic direction of this game. It all looks wonderful. Akira Toriyama, who also worked on stuff like Dragon Ball Z and Dragon Quest, handled the art design for this game, and his fingerprints are all over it. Especially compared to other RPGs back then or today, it pops. It has a look all its own. While many of the monsters in other RPGs just look like generic monsters, everybody and everything in this game has its own look and personality. Everything is stylized to the extreme, and it gives the game a polish that you just don't see a whole lot of anymore. The story mirrors that. It's surprisingly jovial for a game of this genre. Well, okay, dark stuff happens, and oh boy, we'll get to that. But the game feels less like an angsty psychedelic philosophy ride like Final Fantasy, and more like a coherent, simple adventure. It's like one of Hayao Miyazaki's older adventures like Nausicaa or Castle in the Sky, where it's a bunch of kids with good hearts seeking to save the world from a villain who fancies themselves a god. There's definitely room for character development, but it's all in service to the narrative's main direction. Like everything else in this game, the story revolves around defeating Lavos and saving the world. That's it. Everything that happens up to that point, be it characters working out their own issues, or exploring fantastic new worlds and time periods, that's all in service to the main point of defeating Lavos and saving the world. And with that central premise, the story goes in some pretty bold directions. Let's start with the antagonist. Lavos is freaking terrifying. It's probably one of the scariest antagonists ever. It fits a horrifying Lovecraftian mold of unknown, unstoppable alien horror. Every culture has their own theories about the end of the world, but there's just something especially unsettling about a giant bug burrowing its way through the earth, tearing it apart from the inside, absorbing everything that humanity's ever known, and sending its terrible spawn out to other planets to go cultivate them. I don't know about you, but I'd take the fire and brimstone over that any day of the week. I mean, you look at other antagonists like Kefka or Ganondorf, and they at least have a hunger for power or something. But Lavos is emotionless terror. It's an insect. It plows through the earth with only pure instinct running through its brain. And even when it assumes a more human form for the final battle, which, okay, I'll admit that it's a little silly, there's still no real humanity in it. It's just cold, hard nature, staring humanity in the face and waiting until the inevitable. One of the most pivotal moments in the game is when Zeal summons Lavos and you fight it. As in, the final boss, right there, several hours before the actual end of the game, at full strength. It's a fight that you're supposed to lose, for story reasons, but you get to feel how terrifying and strong Lavos is through the gameplay, because, of course, it wipes your team in a single attack. And then it kills Chrono, as in, the main character of the game, the silent protagonist who I, and I'm sure many others, had projected themselves onto. That blew my mind when I played this game for the first time. I mean, a lot of games kill off main characters, with Final Fantasy VII being the big famous example, but surely not Chrono. That'd be like killing off the Dragonborn, or Link, or John Marston. Oh wait, bad example. You get the idea though. This moment serves three purposes. 1, show off how insanely powerful Lavos is. Sure, the party is ready to avenge Chrono and possibly bring him back, but as a player, the first thing I noticed when this happened is that Lavos is not a being to be messed with. Second purpose is that it raises the stakes for the existing characters. It serves as a vision of Lavos' true potential, and as a motivation for the main heroes to fight this thing. Remember when Obi-Wan was killed in the big Death Star escape and Luke was all the more ready to take on Vader and the Empire? Yeah. It's a huge moment. And third is that it opens up the game to whatever ending you may choose. This game has no less than 13 different endings depending on when you choose to fight Lavos and, to an extent, who you choose to fight it with. 2 of them are available in your first playthrough depending on whether or not you choose to go back and save Chrono. And hey, if you want to save Chrono, you have to go back and play those Carnival games again, which is a really effective way to bookend the experience. But of course, the real way to get all the endings is with New Game Plus, which was a wholly new invention at the time. And because you could time travel to the final boss at any point in the game, even at the very beginning, you could change the way the game ends depending on when you fight it. This is where the game's short length and tight focus really come into play, because it's a lot easier to replay a game if the game is short and you get to carry all your endgame stats over. So while only 20 hours might not sound good on the box, that's only one playthrough. You'll be spending a lot of time figuring out how else the game could end. See, Chrono Trigger does a lot of stuff that we take for granted today. New Game Plus, multiple endings, even stuff I didn't get to like loyalty missions. But even though it was way ahead of its time, it's still a fantastic game today. It's aged like fine wine, showing even modern games how storytelling, artistry, and combat is done. It's a pity that this was kind of a one-time thing. I mean, there have been a couple sequels and a few spiritual successors out there on Steam and such, but really, what happened in 1995 between the Dream Team collaborators? Well, that's something that only really happens once an eon. But thankfully, in the Museum of Gaming, it's not just one game that makes history. Wouldn't be much of a museum if that was the case. We'll see you next time for the next of the upcoming 7 games. Until then, see you around.